Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
The first image that showed up on my feed was innocent enough. Someone's cocktail, half empty, backlit by sunset, and balanced artfully on a hotel balcony. I barely blinked at it until my thumb hovered, something in the background catching my attention. Not the ocean or even the palm trees swaying in the amber light, but the blurry flash of a familiar hard-shell suitcase tucked behind the sliding glass door. The same turquoise suitcase with a stupid little pineapple tag I had given my sister Brittany last Christmas because she said she wanted to start traveling more. My heart paused for just a second, some strange instinct tugging at me before I scrolled to the next photo, which showed her tan legs kicked up on a lounge chair beside a hotel pool with the caption, "Living my best life." My first instinct wasn't anger, it was confusion, because Brittany had told me she was going to her friend's place at the lake for a quiet weekend. She'd packed light, barely said goodbye, and left me with a dirty mug in the sink and the Wi-Fi bill sitting unpaid on the entryway table. And yet here she was, half a world away, sipping piña coladas in a resort I couldn't even afford to daydream about while I worked late, folded her laundry, and ordered DoorDash for one like I'd been doing for months. But what made the blood really drain from my face wasn't the trip. It was the next picture. There, lined up like a goddamn commercial, were my parents. My dad in his ridiculous straw hat, my mom wearing the coral blouse I bought her for Mother's Day, both of them beaming like cruise ship mascots, standing arm in arm with Brittany in front of a beachside luau setup. And behind them, sitting innocently on the sand, was the luggage I bought. Mine, technically, surrounded by matching bags I'd never seen before. The caption read, "Family time is everything." It was then, in that exact moment, that a very specific kind of stillness settled into me. It wasn't rage, it wasn't sadness. It was something more dangerous, clarity. I realized sitting there in my dimly lit kitchen with a reheated burrito in my hand and a spreadsheet open on my laptop, that not only had they excluded me, but they hadn't even bothered to cover their tracks. No one had thought I was important enough to lie to you properly. No one had considered that I might feel anything at all. I didn't text. I didn't call. I didn't comment. I simply started watching. Like someone observing a crime scene from behind two-way glass, detached but disturbingly aware of every detail. The beach photos kept coming. Brittany with a flower crown. Brittany in a snorkel mask. My mother tagging the resort in a post with the words, "Unforgettable week with my babies," under a picture where I was very conspicuously absent. For the next 5 days, I did Brittany's chores, paid our electricity bill out of habit, and even restocked the fridge so she wouldn't complain about the lack of options when she got back. I answered a work crisis from my boss at 9 p.m. on a Thursday, while they were probably having their sunset family dinner with grilled pineapple and ukulele music. I even folded the throw blanket she always left crumpled on the couch, because it was part of the illusion that I was okay. But inside, something dark was growing. I had done everything right for so long, worked through college, paid off my student loans without help, built a career with actual health insurance and a retirement plan. Never got arrested, never dropped out, never even asked for a dime. Brittany, on the other hand, had couch-hopped through half her 20s, failed out of 3 different majors, and managed to live rent-free with me for nearly a year while figuring things out. And somehow, I was still the one they overlooked. The day Brittany came home, the house was quiet. I had vacuumed, watered the plants, even wiped down the stove. She burst through the door like someone returning from a quick jog, tanned and relaxed, dragging that familiar suitcase behind her like it hadn't just starred in a betrayal. She smelled like coconut and cheap sunscreen and had the audacity to hum while taking off her sandals. "Hey," she called, like she hadn't vanished without explanation. "Did you end up paying the internet bill?" Mine was acting weird at the hotel. The hotel, not my friend's lake house. She didn't even try to keep the lie straight. I leaned over the kitchen island with a smile I'd practiced all day, held up the smoothie I'd made for her, strawberry banana, her favorite, and said, "Tell me everything about your weekend." She blinked, caught off guard for a second, but then launched into one of her famous meandering stories about how her friend Bailey had won a trip or something, and how she tagged along because it was last minute and barely planned. She was talking fast like she always did when she was improvising, eyes darting around, checking for tells. Unaware that I already knew she hadn't tagged along, she had been on the original itinerary. I just nodded, handed her the smoothie, and told her to sit. "You must be exhausted." She flopped down onto the couch, kicked her legs up like a queen returning to her castle, and started scrolling through her phone, humming to herself. She didn't notice the way I was watching her. She didn't notice the envelope I'd hidden behind the microwave, or the quiet way I slid it into my purse as I left for work the next morning, because I wasn't planning to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to post some passive-aggressive quote on Facebook. No, I was going to wait. Wait until she was comfortable again. Wait until she was sure everything was fine. Wait until the sunburn on her smug little face faded and she forgot all about Hawaii. And then I was going to burn the whole thing down with paperwork. She thought I was soft because I hadn't said a word. But what she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that silence in the right hands is a weapon. When I tell people that my sister Brittany lived with me, they usually assume it was temporary. Maybe a few weeks after a breakup, or while she was job hunting. But what they don't understand, what they couldn't possibly grasp without living through it, is that Brittany didn't move in with a plan, a timeline, or even the courtesy of pretending she was trying. She moved in with a duffel bag, a smirk, and the quiet but unmistakable expectation that I would simply make space, financially and emotionally, the way I always had. Because that's what I'd been conditioned to do since we were kids. Make room for Brittany. Growing up, my parents had a way of managing us that looked like balance to outsiders, but was anything but equal behind closed doors. When Brittany crashed her car at 17, my dad told her it was okay because she was still learning. But when I got a speeding ticket at 19, I was lectured for 2 hours about responsibility and maturity. When Brittany forgot her homework, my mom would write a note for her. But when I missed a deadline, I was accused of laziness. And yet somehow I believed, for far too long, that adulthood would level the playing field, that once we were grown, merit would matter more than charm, and effort would be rewarded instead of taken for granted. But that fantasy crumbled the day Brittany showed up on my doorstep last year, suitcase in hand, and drama dripping off her like perfume, claiming that her roommate was crazy, her job was toxic, and that she just needed a couple of weeks to figure things out, words that should have set off every alarm in my well-trained, over-functioning brain. But instead, I offered her my spare room, gave her the Wi-Fi password, and even picked up her favorite almond milk from the store without being asked, because some part of me still wanted to believe she'd grown, that maybe this time she'd get it right. She never paid rent, not once, and every time I brought it up, even gently, she had an excuse ready to go, always just on the cusp of something. A potential job offer, a freelance gig that hadn't paid yet, a friend who might be moving out soon and offering her a room. She was a professional in the art of almost employed, almost independent, almost ready to contribute. What she was very good at, though, was consumption. My fridge was routinely emptied of anything that didn't require cooking. My shampoo vanished twice as fast, and my living room, which used to be my sanctuary after long work days, became her personal yoga studio, nail salon, and FaceTime stage. I paid the utilities, the rent, the Netflix, and even her rideshare once when she had an emergency that turned out to be a midnight concert. And all the while, she spoke in hashtags and faux gratitude. "You're literally the best," she'd say, tossing her sneakers into the hallway like confetti. Or, "Not all heroes wear capes," when I let her borrow my car to drive to a date with someone named Luca or Logan, or maybe both. My parents knew she was living with me, and yet the only time they ever called was to check in on her. "Is Brittany okay? Has she been eating?" She mentioned feeling overwhelmed. Not once did they ask how I was holding up, if the extra expenses were manageable, or if I needed support. To them, I was the stable one, the one who didn't need coddling, the one who had it together. And while that might sound like a compliment on the surface, what it really meant was that I was invisible unless I failed, and I never gave them the satisfaction. So I became what they expected: unshakable, self-sufficient, endlessly accommodating, until the day I saw that vacation photo. And then everything shifted. Not outwardly, of course. I still cooked dinner, folded my laundry, smiled when she made a mess, but inside something was building, a quiet tally, a record of every favor, every dollar, every lie she told with a smile. And when she returned from Hawaii and made that lazy comment about the Wi-Fi being spotty at the hotel, I realized she hadn't just lied to me. She had assumed I wouldn't even notice. The worst part wasn't that she went without me. It wasn't that she used the luggage I gave her. It wasn't even that she spent time with our parents while I sat at home alone, like an afterthought. It was that she was comfortable doing it. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. Because in her mind, and maybe even in theirs, I didn't count. I decided that night to stop asking for explanations and start looking for evidence. I went through our shared expenses and pulled every bank statement, every digital receipt, every Venmo transaction, and every unpaid IOU she'd scribbled on sticky notes over the past 8 months. I found over $6,000 in unreciprocated expenses, some big, like covering half the rent, and some small, like overpriced takeout or extra Uber rides. But all of it painted the same picture. She had been living like a guest in a hotel she didn't pay for, and I had been the concierge too polite to demand a tip. And that's when I found the message, buried in a shared cloud folder from months ago, a PDF itinerary labeled Morgan Ohana Trip. The date stamp was from 3 weeks before the vacation. The guest list included my parents, Brittany, and a confirmation number from a travel agent I recognized. Because I had recommended her to my mom last summer when I was thinking of planning a solo trip that never happened. I stared at the screen for a long time, my coffee growing cold, my jaw tight, my heart somewhere between numbness and rage. They had planned it, all of them. Not just a spontaneous getaway, not just a last-minute ticket. A fully booked, confirmed, and paid for family vacation. Without the one person who had always footed the bill, literally and metaphorically. And they hadn't even tried to hide it. That's what got me, not the betrayal, the arrogance. They assumed I'd stay quiet, so I did. But I also started printing. Because the next step wasn't a confrontation, it was an audit. And Brittany had no idea that her time on my couch, and in my life, was already counting down. There's a certain moment, if you've ever really been betrayed by your own blood, when your anger shifts from heat to something far colder, something calculating, something that doesn't scream or slam doors, but instead starts taking inventory, weighing debts, running the kind of emotional accounting that leaves you staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night, not because you're sad, but because you're finally, irrevocably done. And that moment for me came not when I found the itinerary, or even when I saw the last vacation selfie of Brittany in her bikini, with a tropical drink in one hand and a ukulele in the other. It came 3 days after she got back, when I heard her laughing in the living room. Laughing so hard she snorted, while talking to someone on speakerphone about how hilariously broke she was because living with my sister is basically like winning the housing lottery. She said it like a joke, but the silence that followed from the other person on the line, followed by their laughter, told me it wasn't a private joke between them. It was a punchline, and I was the setup. So I stopped folding her towels. I stopped buying her almond milk. I stopped being the sister who bit her tongue and convinced herself that if she just waited long enough, people would eventually do the right thing. Instead, I became something far more dangerous to someone like Brittany. I became methodical. It started with research, quiet and unnoticed. I didn't go storming into her room or make a dramatic speech over dinner. I simply opened a few tabs on my laptop, read up on tenant laws in our state, and realized something Brittany had probably never even thought about. She'd never signed a lease, never contributed officially to the household, never had her name on the bills or even the mailbox. She wasn't a co-tenant. She was a guest. And while kicking someone out of your home isn't exactly fun, It becomes a hell of a lot easier when the law says they were never supposed to be there long-term to begin with. I didn't tell anyone, not Jasmine, not even my therapist, who I normally overshared with to an embarrassing degree. I kept it all locked down because for once in my life, I didn't want permission to act. I didn't need someone to validate my choices or remind me to be the bigger person. I didn't want to vent or explain. I wanted results. So I started drafting the notice. I had to look up the wording several times to make sure it was enforceable. No threats, no emotions, just cold, clean language backed by statute. Then I printed it, folded it, slipped it into an envelope like it was a birthday card, and hid it behind the microwave. I wasn't ready to give it to her yet. Timing was everything. Meanwhile, I played my part. When Brittany had a headache, I handed her ibuprofen. When she lost her keys, I helped her look. When she asked me to help edit a resume she clearly wasn't planning to send, I read it over like it actually mattered. I kept being the sister she thought I was, because the real satisfaction wasn't just in kicking her out. It was in watching her build her house of comfort one delusion at a time, unaware that I was already standing there with a wrecking ball in my back pocket. Around that same time, I enlisted help from the one person in my building I knew wouldn't ask questions. Mr. Ruiz, my neighbor from across the hall, a retired Marine with a flat voice and a face like a concrete wall. He once helped me fix a leaking pipe without saying more than 12 words. I brought him a six-pack and asked if he'd mind witnessing a document for me, and being present when I handed it to Brittany. He didn't ask why, just nodded. That's the kind of man he is. As the days passed, my parents still hadn't called. Not a word, not a text. Not even a follow-up after the vacation. It was like they had all taken a collective vow to pretend I didn't exist. Or worse, that I was fine, and therefore unworthy of concern. And honestly, I was grateful, because it meant that when the time came, I wouldn't have to hear their voices, dripping in that special kind of guilt-laced sweetness that only parents can weaponize, trying to talk me down from something I knew was long overdue. On the morning I decided to go through with it, Brittany had borrowed my car without asking, again, and returned it with less than a quarter tank of gas. I told her I had a doctor's appointment. She said, "Oops," and flounced into the kitchen like she owned it. She made herself avocado toast, didn't offer me any, and left a trail of crumbs down the hallway. And that's when I realized she really believed none of it mattered. She thought I was harmless. That night, I made us both dinner. Pasta, garlic bread, her favorite sparkling water. We sat on the couch and watched one of those reality dating shows she liked, and she talked about some guy she was thinking of going on a second date with. Someone she said was probably too intense because he asked her where she saw herself in 5 years, and she'd said, hopefully rich and barefoot. I smiled, nodded, laughed in all the right places. And then, just as the credits rolled, I reached into the drawer, pulled out the envelope, and placed it quietly beside her plate. She blinked, picked it up, opened it, and for the first time since she'd come back from paradise, Brittany Morgan didn't say a word. She read it once, then again, then looked up at me like she'd just seen a ghost crawl out of my chest and slap her across the face. "You're evicting me?" she asked, voice so small it barely carried. "No," I said, standing and collecting our plates. "I'm reclaiming my space." She didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't throw anything. She just sat there, stunned, staring at a reality she had never once prepared for. Because people like Brittany don't plan for consequences. They assume they can charm their way through them. But charm doesn't pay rent. I walked back into the kitchen, placed the dishes in the sink, and let the silence do the rest. Because the loudest revenge is the one that doesn't need an explanation. And I was done explaining. You can prepare yourself for a moment 1,000 different ways in your head. You can rehearse it like a monologue, plan every angle like a chess match, even predict the reactions with the precision of a weather forecast. But nothing quite compares to the actual silence that follows the detonation of a carefully crafted decision, especially when the person you've just obliterated didn't even know a war had been declared. Brittany didn't speak to me that night after I handed her the envelope, and I didn't go looking for conversation because I knew, without doubt, that the next words out of her mouth would come not as a sister, but as a squatter cornered, and I had no interest in playing defense in a house I paid for. She spent the next day in her room with the door closed, music playing too loud through the walls. That irritating playlist she always used when she wanted to be seen as carefree. Some mix of indie pop and aggressive denial. I went about my day like I always did, worked from home in the kitchen, made myself coffee, answered emails, and responded to Jasmine's check-in text with nothing more than a doing fine. I didn't mention the notice, not yet. I wanted the dust to settle, the illusion to break slowly, like ice cracking under weight. Each fracture a reminder that the rules had changed. By the third morning, the door finally opened. Brittany emerged looking like a ghost of herself. Hair messy, eyes rimmed with last night's mascara, holding a mug I hadn't seen since Christmas. She didn't sit, she didn't smile, she just hovered by the counter, her voice flat and full of venom she clearly expected to work like it always had. "You're seriously doing this?" she asked, lifting the notice like it was some disgusting thing she'd found under the couch. "Eviction, really?" I didn't look up from my laptop. "I'm following procedure," I said, calm as stone. "You've had 30 days to figure out your next move." Her laugh was ugly, forced. A sound people make when they realize bluffing won't save them. "You're kicking me out over what? A vacation? You're jealous I went to Hawaii?" I could have answered, could have told her the truth. That it wasn't about Hawaii. That it was about the years of erasure, the expectation that I would keep giving while she kept taking, the quiet sacrifices that had piled up in the corners of our relationship like forgotten junk, unseen, unacknowledged, and yet always there. But instead I just stared at her. "You lied," I said simply. "And you used me." That landed. Her shoulders twitched, as if she wanted to scream but didn't quite know how. She slammed the mug down, spilling half of it, and stormed off with the kind of dramatic stomp that used to work on our parents. And like clockwork, within the hour, my phone buzzed. First it was a text from Mom. "Please don't do anything rash. Brittany is sensitive." Then a call from Dad. One ring, then silence. No voicemail. Classic emotional sniper tactic. Just enough to trigger guilt, not enough to justify a return call. By noon, they'd both left voicemails. My mother using that tight, trembling voice that always implied you're hurting the family, and my father's message sounding eerily calm, which somehow made it worse. "She's your sister," he said. "Don't make a permanent decision over a temporary situation." But that's the thing they never understood. Nothing about this was temporary. Brittany's presence had lingered in my life like a shadow I didn't consent to, a constant reminder that no matter how much I achieved or how well I behaved, there would always be someone getting a free ride on my back, and everyone else would smile and call it helping. That night, she tried a new strategy: tears. Came into the living room with her mascara running and her voice cracking, talking about how lost she felt, how scared she was, how she didn't know where she'd go. She played every note of the pity symphony she'd mastered over the years, waiting for the moment I'd fold. And God help me, part of me wanted to, not because I believed her, but because that was the role I'd played for so long. Rescuer, fixer, the one who bent so others could breathe easier. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled out the stack of papers I'd prepared. Bank statements, receipts, messages, all dated and highlighted. I laid them on the table one by one, like evidence in a courtroom where she was the defendant and I was finally the judge. "This is what I've paid since you moved in," I said, voice level, eyes sharp. "This is what you promised. This is what you never delivered. And this," I added, sliding the final paper across the table, "is the formal documentation that proves you were never a tenant. Just a guest." She didn't cry after that. She screamed, loud and panicked, like a cornered animal, shouting nonsense about betrayal, abandonment, how I was cruel, how I'd always been cold. She called me a control freak, a fake, said I was just bitter and alone. Her voice cracked. She threw a pillow. She slammed her hand against the wall hard enough to knock down one of my framed photos. I didn't flinch. I just watched. Because I knew that tantrum wasn't about me. It was about the collapse of a system where she always landed on her feet because I made sure there was a mattress underneath. She wasn't grieving the relationship. She was grieving the loss of convenience. And still, I didn't yell, didn't retaliate. I walked over to the front door, opened it, and said the 6 words I'd waited my entire adult life to say. You have 27 days. Use them. She stood there shaking, her chest rising and falling in fast, shallow gasps, like she couldn't believe I was really doing it. Then she turned, grabbed her phone, and stormed out into the night barefoot, leaving the door swinging behind her. I closed it, locked it, sat back down, and smiled. Not because it felt good, though part of it did, but because I had finally taken back something I didn't even know I'd lost: my power. The next morning, I changed the locks, and when I looked out the window a few hours later, I saw her in the driveway, suitcase in hand, dialing her phone. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pacing. She was smiling. And in that moment, I knew something wasn't over, but I also knew I was ready. There's a silence that comes after the dust settles, not the peaceful kind that brings clarity or relief, but the heavy, lingering sort that clings to the edges of your day, like thick fog, the kind that makes everything feel louder in its absence. Every creak in the floorboards, every ping of your phone, every stray thought that loops and loops until you can't tell if you're thinking too much or simply avoiding the truth. For a few days after Brittany left, that silence filled the apartment like smoke after a fire. Acrid, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. I didn't hear from her, not directly. She didn't text, didn't call, didn't even rage post on social media like I half expected she would. But my parents filled the gap like a faucet that wouldn't shut off. Voicemails that grew more emotional with each day. Texts from my mother that started with questions and ended with guilt trips. And one particularly long email from my father that began with, "I hope you know what you're doing," and ended with, "Your mother hasn't slept in days." And still I said nothing. Because for once, I wasn't going to step into the familiar role they had written for me. The fixer, the peacemaker, the one who sacrifices her peace so that others can sleep better at night. I was done handing out Grace-like coupons to people who only showed up when it benefited them. Jasmine stopped by that Friday, bringing her usual iced coffee and a bag of croissants that she claimed were for emotional carbs only. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just sat with me, scrolling her phone, occasionally showing me memes about feral raccoons and passive-aggressive inspirational quotes, until finally, after nearly 20 minutes of silence, she looked over the rim of her coffee cup and said, "You're not going to cave, right?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I did. I wasn't going to cave. But admitting that out loud still felt like stepping over some invisible threshold, like I was choosing a version of myself that didn't seek approval or forgiveness, even when it came with loneliness as a side effect. That night, as if summoned by the ghosts of my upbringing, a message arrived from Brittany. It wasn't an apology, not even close. It was short, 3 lines, and yet it hit harder than any of her outbursts. "Let's talk. You might want to see this. Bring your journal." At first, I thought it was a trick, some ploy to guilt me, to dredge up memories that would soften my resolve. But the mention of my journal stopped me cold. Not because I'd forgotten about it, but because I hadn't even thought about it in years. I'd kept that journal all through high school and college, filled with the kind of raw, unfiltered thoughts you only write when you're sure no one will ever read them. An archive of heartbreak, resentment, buried trauma, and the quiet, desperate longing to be seen without having to perform. I hadn't touched it since moving into this apartment. I had assumed it was still buried in one of the sealed boxes in the closet, packed away with old yearbooks and letters I'd never sent. But when I checked, the box was there, half open, the top peeled back like someone had rifled through it in a hurry. And that's when I realized. She had taken it. Not during the last few days. No, she must have taken it before the trip, maybe even months ago, and I, in my usual state of exhaustion and distracted generosity, hadn't noticed. I met her the next day in the lobby of a rundown motel by the freeway. She looked different, not in the way that suggested suffering or remorse, but in the way people do when they've been playing a game you didn't know existed, and suddenly they think they're winning. She handed me a folder, her expression unreadable. Inside were photocopies, pages from my journal. But they weren't just copied. They were highlighted, annotated, certain lines circled in red, comments written in the margins in my mother's handwriting. "You showed these to Mom?" I asked, my voice low and flat. "She found them," Brittany replied, voice like ice, "when I brought the box to pack for the trip. Said it explained a lot about why you're so controlling." I couldn't speak, not because I was shocked, but because I finally understood the smile she wore that morning in the driveway, the calm, smug curve of someone who knew she'd flipped the script. And it worked. Suddenly, I wasn't the overworked, underappreciated sister. I was the bitter, angry spinster with a grudge and a god complex, unraveling years of family dysfunction into neat, weaponized sentences on lined paper. Brittany stood, pulling her hoodie tighter around her, her expression not cruel, but quietly triumphant. "I just thought you should know why they're really mad," she said almost gently. "They think you hate them." I left the folder on the bench and walked out without another word, because there was nothing left to say. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easily a person can turn your own truth against you, how even honesty in the wrong hands becomes a blade, and how sometimes the most painful part of a story isn't what they did to you. It's what you allowed for years before finally saying no. The calls haven't stopped. My father keeps leaving voicemails that grow colder by the day. My mother sent me a handwritten letter, the kind she only wrote on Christmas, saying she no longer recognizes the daughter she raised. And Brittany, she's still at the motel. Or maybe not, I haven't checked. I won't. You want to know if I regret it? I regret trusting people who taught me my needs were optional. I regret waiting this long to stop explaining myself. But do I regret the eviction? No, I regret not doing it sooner. Because the moment she walked out of my life, really walked out, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. And for the first time in my adult life, that was enough.